Well, hello and welcome. My name is Richard Eng. I am really excited to talk with us today and bring together a really a phenomenal panel almost to talk about an important topic. If you don't know who I am the lead pastor at Bethel Evangelical Free Church up in Devil's Lake, North Dakota. And so it is beautiful outside, 72 degrees and hot. Uh, and so we were out at the carnival this in the last hour with my kids doing some little roller coasters that were on the back of a truck 2 days ago. So that was a little nerve wracking, but we're here now. And I put these monthly webinars on for two purposes. First is so that you can understand the times and that you can live faithfully as a witness of the gospel. And so these webinars are for believers in Jesus, and I get those two purposes from two key texts. Of course, First Chronicles 12:32, which talks about these men of Issachar who, and this is where the phrase comes from, who had understanding of the times. But then it says to know what Israel ought to do. So in order to be wise, you have to pay attention and be aware of the trends or the mood of your world around you. And when you do that, wisdom comes, not automatically, but you also can't be wise without paying attention. And then 2 Corinthians 5:20 says, therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. So when you are informed and when Christ is at work in and through you, then you are a good ambassador representing the kingdom of God. So today, we are talking about a really important topic, the Enneagram. And of course, you probably saw the thumbnail or the title. And in the last, probably longer than this, but at least for me, in the last decade, I've noticed it. It's become quite the popular psychological tool in America, but also in the church. So ministries or churches will use it alongside spiritual gifts assessment, for team building, for resolving conflict. Some ministries, even like Career International, they'll use it for discipleship. And so I found an article on their website called How Our Enneagram Type Can Reveal the Image of God in Us. And so if you read through that article, you'll say, well, if you're this type, after taking the assessment, you're a number one, here's how, walking with Jesus might look for you, or here's how you might uniquely contribute to the life of the church or outreach or those sorts of things. But the problem is that there's some real problems with the Enneagram. And in my view, problems that make the Enneagram a tool that is not something we should use. So by the end of this webinar, here's what my hope is: that you will see first that it has serious problems just evaluating it from a psychological perspective. And that's best case scenario, that it's bad psychology. And worst case scenario, it is replete with unbiblical assumptions. It doesn't come from a biblical worldview. It can't be defended. And so here's what I want to do. I want to spend our time unpacking those two things. And so here with me today, I have Jay Medenwaldt and Alexa Cramer, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves here in a moment. But I just want to say thank you guys for joining us, and I'm excited to have you on tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Excited to be here.
Jay, why don't we start with you? Why don't you introduce yourself a bit?
Yeah, so I got involved with the Enneagram. It was probably about 2017 when I had some friends introduce it to me during seminary, and they presented it sort of as a new personality test that is way better than any other test. And so it was a couple years after I'd finished my master's degree in psychology, and I'd spent a couple years teaching. So I thought, okay, well, maybe this came up and I missed it or something, and it is this new good test. And so I started looking into some of the peer-reviewed literature on it and found that there really wasn't much, and what was there wasn't very favorable. So I set out to write a little about it just to kind of check my biases and see if maybe I was being unfair. And that just opened up a lot of opportunities to write and speak on the Enneagram. And so I just kind of fallen into this world, and during my PhD program, I wrote an article for Christianity Today, and that opened up a few more doors. And so I've just kind of been involved within it just because there isn't really much academic research on it, and what is there isn't critical. It's all kind of trying to
Sure.
validate it. And you see that in the hypotheses in some of the articles, most of which aren't peer reviewed. There's a lot of dissertations and things where they expect the Enneagram to work, and then when it doesn't, they kind of are surprised, or they try to focus on what does work. So we often have mixed results. So I'm currently working on a study right now to examine it based on some of the claims that it makes.
Good. And we'll dig a little bit into that, what your research is right now. But thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So Alexa, what about yourself?
Well, I am a mom from Michigan, and I contribute to the Mama Bear Apologetics blog and work with that ministry. And so a few years ago, I wanted to look into the Enneagram because it was going around in my circles of friends. And so I asked Mama Bear if I could look into writing an article about it. And that article turned into a 3-part series. And that research kind of snowballed from there because I just kept having more questions and going down more rabbit holes. And it turns out that the Enneagram is just a really good vehicle to have a lot of other important conversations that Christians need to be thinking about, like syncretism versus legalism, and just different questions about Christian living, theological questions. It opens up so many doors. So I just kind of kept going with the research and creating content about it. So, yeah.
I love that. Isn't it funny how you just start down a path and you think, oh, this is going to be fun for a few minutes, and then it's like a multi-year, it's never ending, right? Oh, that is just so relatable.
Was not expecting that.
Exactly. Well, let's talk a little bit about, you kind of touched on it already, Alexa, but what kind of let's say this, just to kind of get our feet in the door a bit. As you've researched the Enneagram, what have you found about its origins that have caused you concern?
What have I not found about its origins that have caused me concern? That is a rabbit hole that just keeps going deeper and deeper, I feel like. So a lot of times we get accused of the genetic fallacy, which is either accepting or rejecting a claim or an idea based on where the idea came from rather than evaluating the idea itself. But this is different than the genetic fallacy because the history of the Enneagram and the origins of the Enneagram really illuminate the worldview that was used in developing the system. And it shows us the ideas that really are baked into it because it came out of it was developed over, 70, 50 years. We know that it came from the early 1900s, and then it was added to and developed in the 60s and 70s. But these were spiritual. I keep losing my train of thought. It's basically like these are occultic environments where they are trying to tap into the spiritual realm. So this was not a psychological tool. It became a psychological tool, but it was a melding of psychological and the spiritual. So it's been kind of repackaged and remarketed today to look like just, some spiritually neutral psychological tool that anybody can use, anybody can apply their worldview to. But I think Jay's going to go into the details of the history and the origins, but it's just important to see what kinds of ideas are being, that were developing the Enneagram in the first place, because it's based on esoteric laws, spiritual laws, like the law of 3 and the law of 7, which are these laws about the nature of the universe and God, but what they mean by God is not what we mean by God. And those are all ideas that are the foundation of how the Enneagram works and why it was developed the way it was. It was meant to get you to a higher consciousness, and to tap into that, to the spiritual realm. So it should raise some red flags for Christians where it came from.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jay, as you've looked into it, what are kind of just really same question to you. And then as you've seen it, you kind of mentioned it rose to popularity in the last, what you said mentioned 2017 or so. What have you seen about its origins and history?
Yeah, so my initial approach was to say, okay, the origins of it don't really matter because that is the genetic fallacy. We don't want to discard it just because of where it came from.
Right.
In time, as kind of Alexa said, we should be thinking about it in terms of red flags. So, likelihood that it's true based on where it came from, or if there are some underlying assumptions that are false. So, like the law of three and the law of seven, like these are numerology things that they're supposed to be hidden meaning in things and numbers, and so which we know is not true, and so that's put into the Enneagram to make it work. And so I've been very careful in not rejecting it just because of where it came from, because even if it's based on numerology, it could still be true. It could be accurate. It could make good predictions about people. And so you have to consider that point, but also it should kind of just warn us like, oh, okay, what is the likelihood that it's true if it's based on this alone, if we're looking at nothing else, especially when we compare it to something like the Big Five, which is by far the most dominant used in psychology for research. It was way more accurate. And so what they did when they developed the Big Five, and it sort of happened in among independent researchers and has been confirmed and supported over and over again. But they started with the dictionary and looked at every word in the dictionary that could possibly be used as a descriptor of personality. And then they whittled that list down more and more, got rid of some of the redundancies, and went from, so started with a dictionary of 400,000 words, whittled that down to 4,000, whittled it down even more, and then started collecting data to see what terms lump together, which ones, if you say, yes, I'm like this, what other ones are similar, and that's how they developed the Big Five. Whereas with the Enneagram, it's sort of these informal observations, basically from what two guys think is how people can be divided. No research, no analyzing their data to see if it confirms their assumptions or not, and so just based on that alone, we say, well, which one seems more likely to accurately describe people, and that should kind of focus there as a starting point.
Right. And so we talk about these red flags, right? It's just because something or an idea comes from somewhere doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, right? Uh, I think the question, though, as both of you pointed out, is can you separate some of those mystical, assumptions about God or the self or, the nature of like our sin nature? Do we have one? What does the Enneagram say about that? Like how it came into, developed where it is today. Can that be separated from how it started? Right. Uh, it's like an example I think of when I think of the genetic fallacy is imagine if Henry Ford said, I hate God, and so I'm going to spit on his creation of horses and make my own mechanical way of getting around, just as my act of rebellion, right? Uh, well, that's not a reason, even if that were true, which I don't think it is, that wouldn't be a good reason for us to not drive cars today, right? Just because he was a rebellious, crazy person, right? Because cars can be separated from that belief, right? And from that attitude. But if the Enneagram today cannot be separated from practices or attitudes or assumptions, that's where the origin becomes relevant.
Yeah, and I think in theory that it can. If you drop certain bits and say, okay, this part they got wrong, and then this part is right, and add to it and say, here's something new. And so in theory, I think that could be done, but in practice, I haven't seen that happen. What's kind of happened with the development of the Enneagram is a refusal to critique it and drop things and just add on to it and put more things to try to make it fit to different people or situations or be used in different ways, rather than saying, nope, this part was wrong, let's get rid of that, that's not part of the Enneagram anymore, I'm not going to use that. Because with a lot of the Enneagram community, they're very supportive of each other, referring to each other in books and speaking at conferences. And so they're not saying, no, my research shows this is wrong. So like Jerome Wagner has the Web's test, and, I talked to him on a Zoom call about it. And he said he doesn't think that the triads or the triads bear anything out and aren't reliable, but he still mentions them in his book, but he doesn't openly critique them. So there's this hesitancy to really be critical within those who are using it and to drop certain parts that aren't right.
And for those who don't know, when you say triads, what do you mean by that?
So that's, if you look at the Enneagram image, it's got kind of the different types are divided into 3 sections. So 8, 9s, and 1s form one triad, and then 2s, 3s, and 4s are another, and then 5, 6, and 7. So it's the head, heart, and the gut or body. Sometimes it's called. This is like our thinking style, kind of is how it's described. And so there's a few studies that looked at that, which Jerome Wagner actually supervised these dissertation projects, which is why he doesn't think that they're valid, but then he still talks about them. Occasionally he kind of downplays them, but he doesn't flat out say in his writing that it's not right.
Wow. Alexa, you looked like you have a thought. You're ready.
Yeah. I think it's hard to separate the spiritual ideas and the mystical ideas from the system, because I think it conflates personality preferences and tendencies with character, because they're always talking about struggles. A lot of times they're talking about sin, whether they use the word sin or not. They're talking about like your core problem. And it comes with it a lot of assumptions about human nature and about what it means to be. The whole thing is trying to get to your true self. Who are you really? So your identity. And so there's a lot of spiritual assumptions that are, I think, inherent in the system that I don't know how, because once you find your number, it's the Enneagram's a map to help you in growth. And so I'm not sure how you can even remove the spiritual angle from it and still have the same system there.
Yeah, so we think about how where it came from, and we haven't talked about Richard Rohr yet. I think it'd be important to talk about him because he's, as I think about how it became popular, you are waiting for that. I love that. Tell us about who Richard Rohr is, Alexa, before I just you got to be the one to talk about him.
Oh my gosh, Richard Rohr. Okay, Richard Rohr is a Catholic priest, a Franciscan friar. And he is basically at the root of how the Enneagram became Christianized. He's the one who popularized it for Christians. But Richard Rohr, his worldview, in my opinion, is very, very problematic. I'd go as far as to call him a false teacher. I think he teaches a totally different gospel. I have all kinds of quotes from him. If you want to see, I've been reading his book on the Trinity. But basically, I think that the Enneagram is a Trojan horse for his theology, and I think he's his. Do you want me to give you some description of what he believes? Okay, yeah. So he believes that let's see, he's a perennialist. He believes that all religions lead to God. The same God. He is a panentheist, so he believes, this is actually very foundational for his belief system, that God is, pantheism is where everything is God. God is in all things. Panentheism is God is in all things, and all things are one, but God also transcends all things. So there's not a huge difference, but I don't know. Maybe they use panentheism to justify a pantheistic worldview.
There you go.
And it's interesting that this kind of monistic, pantheistic worldview is what the Enneagram came out of. And so it really his view of God and his worldview really matches the original Enneagram intentions really well, except that he ends up putting Christian language all over the Enneagram. And so then people don't really realize that what he's saying, he doesn't actually mean a lot of times what you think he means. And so he is promoting these ideas of the true self and the false self, which is what the Enneagram is predicated on. I don't know if we talked about that yet. Do you want to get into that?
Yeah, we've said that. Yeah, when you take the test, it's supposed to be a map, like you said, to grow or to find your true self, right? But if it's based on bad psychology that hasn't been tested or faulty assumptions, then it's not going to be a helpful map because it's not accurate in the first place.
Right.
And one thing I'll say, so with Richard Rohr, Alexa mentioned it as a Trojan horse. And so when talking about the Enneagram, his name comes up a lot. I've heard people say, they got into the Enneagram and then got into Richard Rohr, whether that was they directly introduced to him through the Enneagram, but they were into his Enneagram writings, and that led them to other Richard Rohr writings and his theology. But I've also heard it go the other way, where people have come across his other writing and then gone into his Enneagram stuff. And so it kind of is both of his Enneagram work and his, I guess you could call it theology. People are kind of getting introduced to him through one way or the other. So it's kind of like he's spreading different areas to reach and influence people.
Right. Yeah, and the Enneagram seems to be because it defines sin in a particular way, or the old self or the false self, I guess, in a particular way. It just ends up being, very similar language, I guess, to what Richard Rohr talks about. Like, what was that video you made the other day, Alexa, where you're fake sitting in class and listening to him like, yeah. And he's saying things that are just like about original sin and basically denying that. And it was just, like, wait a minute, hang on, time out. You go, this guy seems very wise and well-spoken, and he has kind of a way with words, and then he'll say something like that undermines orthodoxy.
Yeah, he sees sin as more of like a blockade of, like, love is supposed to be flowing freely. He sees God, he says that God is personal, but he really personalizes God, so that God is more of like a force of love. And this flow is supposed to be flowing through all of us. And if you block that flow of love, that's what he calls sin. And he'll say that it's, it comes through the fixations, and the fixations are the sins on the Enneagram. So that's that's a blockage. It's more about blocking yourself from the love of God than it is. It's not rebellion against God. It's not breaking God's moral law. He thinks that that's kind of like tribal thinking, and kind of that's for people on a lower consciousness level, like me.
There you go. Okay, so let's talk about it from just like we've discussed its origins and kind of why it came to popularity, but let's just talk about it purely on a psychological level. And so we've hinted on this, but Alexa, tell me how it's supposed to work. And I should confess, I have not taken the Enneagram. I started to fill it out because I was curious. I'm like, I should probably fill it out for this interview. And I got like halfway through, and I just kept thinking to myself, I could answer these questions so many different ways. And contrasted with other personality things I've done, like Gallup Strength Finders or whatnot, that seem to actually, they seem to work better. But tell me how it's supposed to work.
Well, you're supposed to, there's 9 points on the diagram, and every point represents a type. So it's a number with a list of traits associated with it. And everybody supposedly can identify with one main type, because each type is characterized by a fixation or a sin, whatever word. It's the same. They mean the same things, but a lot of different teachers use different terms. But that becomes your main drive and motivation to, it's like the thing that is, it's like a coping mechanism to try and protect your true self. So your each number is like a false construct, a false identity. And the goal is to figure out what your false self is so that you can move towards your new self. Or I'm sorry, not your new self, your true self. So what else, where else do you want me to go with? What do you mean by how it makes you feel like it works?
I think that's a good way of of thinking through the question, because people wouldn't do this if it didn't bear some fruit, even in the short term.
Yeah. So in my findings, I'm looking at it more from the perspective of comparing it to how other tools work to like trick the brain. So my husband is a massive nerd, and when he was younger, he got really into magic and illusions and mentalism, and just acquired a ton of books on that. And so when I started looking into the Enneagram, he handed me this book on cold reading, which are like psychic readings and fortune telling. It's like giving somebody a reading, and it exposes the tactics of what they do to manipulate the client, because they can make you feel like they are getting information from the spirit realm, and it's really a manipulative psychological trick. And I'm not saying that there's no such thing as a demonic influence in those cases, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying at least we know that there's manipulation going on. And I just noticed that there were so many tactics that I'm like, I can see this like clear as day in the Enneagram. And so basically the founding principle of all of how it works is a lot of generic, at least in my opinion, Jay's got the scientific explanation for it, but from what I see, there's a lot of vague statements, generic statements, and then it's all linked together with an explanation for why it is the way it is, why you are the way that you are. But your brain is filling in all of the meaning and significance of these statements. And you don't realize that these are vague, generic statements because you're just automatically reading it and filling in memories and ideas. Like you're like, oh, this describes my friend perfectly. And you could point to stories. There's a big thing, and all of the Enneagram teachers, almost all of them have series on this type, your type in childhood. And that's one of the tactics that like a psychic will do, is they will bring up a childhood story and they'll just start telling you what your childhood was like. And people really resonate with it. And it sounds like they're getting this information from that they're having this amazing insight into your life, when it's just, there's common experiences that people have. And then you fill in the information with your brain, and then it feels like it's specific to you, and it's just a big illusion.
Especially when those things that it's saying are kind of your internal thoughts. So it's like sometimes you struggle with self-doubt. Like, oh my goodness, I struggle with that so much. It's like, yeah, but everyone does to different degrees. Maybe a handful of people don't. Narcissists maybe, although there's different types of narcissists and some might. But when it gets to these internal thoughts that we all have, but we don't often talk about with other people, when it's got this broad statement and then there's a collection of them, there's multiple of these broad statements that apply to a lot of people, like, oh my goodness, that hits me. That's me exactly. Well, yeah, because it's 80% of the population. It's not just you. And so it feels really accurate, really quick. And the original study to look at this was from Bertram Forer. So sometimes it's called the Forer effect, Forer, although more commonly known as the Barnum effect, named after P.T. Barnum. But what he did in that original study is he gave his students a personality test and then gave them their results the next week and asked them to rate how accurate the results were. And most of the ratings were like a 4 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5. There was like 1 or 2 3s and like 1 below 3. And then he told them the secret. They all got the same results back. And he got these, he made up the results from a astrology book and compiled some things together to be broad general statements. And I do this in class, and it works every time in class. Even after sometimes when I talk to my students about it, it's still, they're like, oh, this is so accurate. And then, we talk about it and go through, and, they get the hint. And so it can feel eerily accurate, even these Barnum statements. It feels, holy cow, this has to be right. And even one of the early papers referring to the 4 one, and this other one is because after World War II, personality testing became really big business, and a lot of people started selling these to corporations, different personality tests. And so the psychologists were testing these, and they're like, why is this working? And so in this paper, I think it's one by Sandberg, he says the common sales pitch for a salesperson is, you know what, just take my test, and if it doesn't speak to you, if you don't find it eerily accurate, then I won't even ask you to buy it. And then the unsuspecting manager takes a test that feels eerily accurate, and he spends a whole lot of money on this test that isn't worth the paper it's printed on. And so we see this in this context of what's been tested, what we've done, what we know, and how this works. And that's kind of gone away, but now we see it popping up again with the Enneagram and these broad sort of statements. And I'm actually running a study right now to test this and look at it. And we have some preliminary data, and we do see people are rating their personality types very high, even if they're given the wrong one. So we give people an Enneagram test, and then we give them a fake result. It's just random. And then we look to see, were you randomly given your actual type, your second type, your third type, or whatever, and then looking at that. And if the Barnum effect wasn't playing a role, we would expect a slow, gradual decrease to lower scores, or even a very quick decrease, but we don't. We see kind of the first couple are really high, and then the next few, it's just a flat line. They're all kind of rated equally, basically, from their third type to their ninth, with maybe a little bit of decline, but still, and they're still very high scores. So people who are even getting their lowest scoring type are still rating it on average like a 3.5 out of 5.
Wow.
So you're telling me, Jay, that either your sample could be all 9 types, which, man, good for them, or they're all generic enough that they relate to any one of them, and it isn't it isn't saying anything of meaning, like what you're saying, Alexa. You fill your brain in with the answers.
Well, so a couple important things about the Enneagram. So one is this claim that everyone only has one type, and that type never changes. So, and I'll get a lot of critics, maybe if anyone's listening, will say, well, you can change your type, and that's the purpose, is so you grow and improve. And while you can grow and make improvements, every single book I've read, Enneagram book, every resource, over and over, it very explicitly states your main type never changes. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's always your type. But in the data, both in my data and other studies that have looked at this, I've gotten a couple other data sets. About 10% of people don't clearly have a type from taking a test. They tie, and that's just from taking it once. So they get a tie for their top score. So they don't really know what their type is. And then if test, retest reliability, so people take a test more than once, maybe they'll change types as well. And then the other part with the Enneagram is, so not only do you only have one type that never changes, but you have, and we all have aspects of all the types. So it really plays into this cold reading thing Alexa was talking about. It's like, well, here's your type, but that type doesn't quite fit you. Well, that's because you have this wing, which is another way to kind of make it seem more accurate. Or you have this, this is connected with your line of integration, or it's because of some experience you have aspects of this other type that are just coming out more, even though it's not connected to your type at all.
So it's not falsifiable.
I mean, it is in theory, but it's very hard. And so some of the research I'm doing is trying to pin that down in very specific ways. But the people who are using and promoting the Enneagram aren't psychologists for the most part. And those who are don't really have good training in test validity and that. So they're very hesitant to make clear, distinct predictions about what it should say and what it shouldn't. So I've been trying to sort of nail that down and be clear and distinct based on what the Enneagram actually says or the teachers say, and so that we can test that.
That's fascinating. By the way, if you're watching this live, please drop some comments in the chat, because we're going to have a time of Q&A here at the end. But let's tease that a little bit. What was Jesus's main type? I love that question.
I've been told that if God were to look, or if you were to type God, he would be all 9 of the types perfectly. Jesus might have a type. I don't know. An 8.
Maybe that's the human nature, right? He has one type, but the divine nature has all 9. Yeah. I appreciate your sarcasm. I can tell.
When we talk about personality types as well, from a psychology perspective, types are automatically problematic because you start to lump in a lot of things that don't necessarily go together. So if we just look at, so the Big 5 uses the scale of extroversion. So you score high, you're an extrovert. You score low on extroversion, call you an introvert, right? Most people score somewhere in the middle, right? And our scores, we know, fluctuate a little bit. Personality is consistent and stable traits about us, but it does vary a little from time to time, right? So if we're just drawing a line down the middle and saying, here's extroverts, here's introverts, right? People are going to change. There's no magical force saying you can't become more extroverted or less extroverted over time, right? And so now instead of just looking at one factor, extroversion, the Enneagram lumps in a bunch of them together and says, okay, now all these different things about you, no matter how you change the person or grow or what experiences you have, somehow there's a magical force that you're always going to be highest on this set of traits, which go together, which we know just isn't how people work. Most people are, if we look and think about like a standard, like a normal curve, most people fall in the middle somewhere, and we fluctuate a little on everything, right? And so to say people are never going to change is just extremely unrealistic and doesn't describe what we know about people in every way.
Let's talk about. It doesn't seem like just talking through this, it's bad psychology. We think we've talked through that. Compare that to something else. Like you've mentioned, Jay, the Big 5. What does good personality assessments? What do they do different than the Enneagram? And Alexa, I'm curious what tools you would recommend instead of the Enneagram, right?
So I'll go first. I guess I wasn't sure if that was to both of us but
yeah, Jay
so
first.
Big 5 is sometimes called the 5-factor model or the ocean model. They're all referring to the same thing. I actually suggest using CANOE as an acronym. Ocean works, but CANOE because some of the traits we can see as like meta traits. But the 5 factors are conscientiousness, openness to experience, neuroticism, or sometimes called negative emotionality, agreeableness, and then extroversion. So those are kind of the 5. And a real detailed version of the Big 5 will break up those Big 5 into either called facets or aspects. And that can range from 2 sort of sub traits into as many as 30. And so it can get a very detailed picture, depending on which version of it you use, of how we are and what our general natural tendencies are. And so that's kind of the gold standard within psychology, and by far the most widely used. And the big difference there is, one, the categories themselves, we know, do a very good job of describing people in general. They're not going to be perfect in all or every situations. For the most part, we see it cross-culturally. Sometimes there's a little differences of culture, but that's just coming down to sometimes they run together. Or in some Eastern cultures, we'll see like a cultural sort of personality factor arise, but those 5 still typically remain intact. And so for one, we know the categories themselves are valid and apply to everyone. And the other part is that Big 5 doesn't categorize people into types. It looks at your score in a continuum. So you can say, well, I'm high on openness, but low in neuroticism, moderate on conscientiousness. And you can see this sort of flexibility within that. And so it's not lumping everyone together in this group.
It's really good. Alexa, what tools would you recommend then as you've studied it and looked for alternatives?
Okay, well, I get asked this question pretty much every time, and I probably need to work on a better answer. But the reason I struggle with it is because I think most people who are, at least in my observations, people that are using the Enneagram are looking for some kind of spiritual growth and improvement in relationships and all that too. But I've just found, for me personally, the more that I am drawn to studying the nature of God and his word, my eyes are taken more to focus on him. And I'm kind of, I find that like studying the Trinity, for example, is going to give people more of the answers that they're looking for than using the Enneagram. Because I think the Enneagram can be a replacement for the Holy Spirit, because it makes claims that are roles for the Holy Spirit, that it's going to guide you, it's going to convict you of your sin. And so I often recommend the study He's Where the Joy Is, so it's not a personality study, but if you really get to know the Lord and really get to know the Trinity and each person of the Trinity, I think that you're going to find that there's a lot more insight going that route. And I'm not saying there's no purpose for personality systems or anything, which is why I still need to do more research probably. That's so I can have a better recommendation for if anybody's looking specifically for that. But I'd defer to Jay on that part.
Yeah. Jay, you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say the big five. The problem is there isn't really a good work that I know of where it really looks at the big five in context of spiritual growth and development, although we have research on that area and we know enough about it, but there's been no one that's really taken up the mantle to kind of popularize that or put that in a simple, easy to understand, digestible sort of fashion like people have done with the Enneagram books. And that's one of my complaints with the Enneagram isn't necessarily that it's so terrible and bad, but that if some of these Enneagram authors had spent the hundreds or thousands of hours learning the big five and writing a book about that and how that can be used, I think that would be a lot more fruitful. Even if they get things wrong occasionally here and there, you have a much more solid base of understanding people more accurately that can be more useful. But with the way that people often use the Enneagram for self-reflection, conversation with friends, growth and understanding, I think just taking a big five test and then taking your score and then having those discussions with other people and really thinking about, okay, what does it mean if I score high on neuroticism, for example? It's like, oh, well, it means I'm anxious a lot and worry. I'm probably stressed out. Maybe I'm stressing out other people, my partner or kids. And maybe, people high in neuroticism tend to be more critical of things in general. And so, if you start to learn about these things, you're like, oh, okay, well, this is how maybe it affects my relationships with other people. Or you ask, and say, hey, Alexa, how does it make you feel when we have conversations and I'm very stressed, right? You can have those conversations just from learning about your big five score. And I think you can get the same results and probably even better because you're using a more valid system to start with. It just takes a little bit more work because someone hasn't given you a cookie cutter kind of outline, so to speak.
But isn't that discipleship, right? It's the process of you learn a little bit about yourself and you have to wrestle with it. And you go to like you said, a brother or sister in Christ, and you say, hey, I'm trying to learn about myself and why I am the way that I am. And here's this modern psychology that can perhaps speak into that and help me to be at least self-aware and my effect on others or whatever. But yeah, no, that's really good. That's really good.
In that context of discipleship, I think, and the Enneagram can be used for that, but the difference with the big five and the Enneagram, so where the big five can be sort of a map or a way to disciple yourself or others and lead you down a path that, that's true and accurate and real, better understanding. I think the Enneagram, for some people, it nails it. It's spot on. It can be really helpful, right? Because, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Not to disparage it, but the Enneagram, I think, is really accurate for some people in a detailed, specific way, not in a broad, general way it is for others. But for a lot of other people, the Enneagram is sort of a false map, and it leads them astray, and it leads them to categorize themselves in ways that they aren't really, doesn't really describe them, or to look back at their past and their history with a certain pair of glasses that isn't very accurate, and can lead them astray into less understanding. I've actually seen this happen in a conversation. I was mediating a conversation with some friends in ministry. They were having, one of the members of the group was having some difficulty in their communication with them, and so both sides asked me to mediate. And two of the leaders were using the Enneagram and like, okay, this is this person's type. This is what he really wants because of his type. Here's where the conversation is going to go, and all this. And they have this plan coming in. And then as I'm, observing this conversation and just listening, they were putting him in this box where he didn't fit. And so I asked them at the end of the conversation, both sides, how they think it went. The people using the Enneagram thought it went great. Their perception, yep, we understood him. We saw where he was going. We answered his questions, right, and all that. Whereas I'd asked the other person, he's like, I didn't feel heard. They didn't understand anything I was saying. So there's completely different perception of the same experience. And that's because they weren't really listening to him, even if they probably had his Enneagram type right, because I think the guy even said that type best describes him, right? It just leads us down this road of these false assumptions or overly rigid view of people that we're just not that easily categorical.
Right. Well, and I've even seen conflict arise because you go, I've heard people say things like, well, I don't know. The numbers mean nothing to me because I don't know what any of them mean. But, I'm a 1 and well, they're a 1. So that's why we don't get along. And I'm like, well, maybe, or maybe there needs to be some forgiveness here. Maybe there needs to be some like actual conversation and come together. It almost feels like the Enneagram creates, like, to use a word that you guys have both used, identity, that creates problems. And you can probably say that of just about any psychological tool. And if you focus in on it too much and say, well, they're just high in neuropathy, and then you just write people off. But there's something about the Enneagram, at least to me and how I've seen it, that people, like you said, they put people in boxes, and then when those don't work, it's not that it didn't work. It's that, maybe you just have to do it differently or whatever. It becomes unfalsifiable almost. But yeah.
They're stereotypes, and it's
Right.
generally not a good idea to stereotype people.
Right. Yeah,
But there's a reason why stereotypes exist. So
yeah, and that's where categories. Once you put categories around things, people like simple and easy, and so when any system does that, even the Myers-Briggs or some of these other systems, put these categories on people, or even with mental disorders, that's an issue that clinical psychologists deal with, is labeling people, because once people have that label and category, it shapes the way they think about themselves and others. And so that's where I like systems more that uses a continuum where everyone fits somewhere on this continuum, and knowing that even our scores might change a little bit over time, or if we're intentional, could even change drastically over time.
Right. Very good. I really appreciate you guys' insights here and covering what we wanted to cover. I want to make sure we get to comments, because people are dropping comments and some good questions that I want to make sure we get to. And so let's see. I'm scrolling through these. Here's one. Scientology has similarities, seeking to clear persons from themselves, right? This was posted earlier when we were talking about its origins, and what the underlying assumptions are, and what were. But any comments you guys want to make on this?
Or Scientology actually also uses personality tests. And that's one of the things, if you're walking by a Scientology center, the first thing they'll do, you want to come in and take a personality test, because they know they can use this same Barnum effect to wrap people in, to make it feel accurate. Like, oh, your test understood me. You must have something right and accurate here. and they don't open their data up for anyone to use and to run psychometric tests or anything on it as well, and neither do pretty much any of the Enneagram people, because they want to protect that from falsification.
Exactly. Here's a comment from someone. Jay, you may or may not know who this is. From your wife. But she really had a great comment. Sometimes Christians forget that just because someone uses biblical language or words we hear in church, it doesn't mean they mean what we mean. We have to ask what they mean. So I think at that point, I remember, Alexa, you were talking about just what they mean by God, what we mean by God, right? So always asking that question, what do you mean by that? And get to the actual definition.
Yes, exactly. What do you mean by the true self, the false self? What do you mean by the new self, the old self? What is the Bible actually? How does the Bible define that? How does the Bible define these terms? It's a whole
that's
thing.
A big one, is the true self and false self. That comes up in the Enneagram. And I think maybe some Enneagram authors are more careful with that, but others use it in the sense of, even the word personality, many of them describe personality as this bad thing, that it is your mask, and your true self is getting rid of your personality, which that's way different than psychologists use the term personality. So it's not even a way we use Christian terms, it's any term, just to be careful to see if we're using them the same way. And sort of related to that, every Enneagram book I have, and I've got a stack full of like 30 of them, they all refer to the Enneagram as a personality system in some way. But the number one critique I get from people when I speak about the Enneagram and being a personality system is that it's not personality. It's more than that, or it's about motivations. It's like, well, again, for personality psychologists, anything that can be described as individual differences between people counts as personality. Some will even consider intelligence part of personality, although others might consider that something different. But motivation, if you take a personality course, you're going to spend a week or two probably talking about motivation, and so it includes that. And one thing that I find a little ironic about the Enneagram is when you talk about personality, they say that the Enneagram of personality, but it's really about core motivations, and those are what's stable and consistent over time. That's the opposite of what we see in psychological research. So our personality traits, like the big 5 factors and things like that we see, are consistent and stable over time, and motivations tend to be less stable, whereas the Enneagram flips that on its head and is saying that these core motivations are more stable and less changing.
Fascinating. Brittany had a comment. They say mistypes happen when you're not healthy. Isn't that it? We just have talked about this a couple times, that anytime there's evidence to the contrary, there's reason for that, and I like to use the example when I do training teenagers, especially on logical fallacies, and I talk about falsification, and I tell them, did you know that Christianity is falsifiable? And then teenagers get really weird about it. I'm like, no, it's a good thing, because if something isn't falsifiable, then it's actually difficult to know if it's even true or not. And the example that I always give is, well, did you know that every millionth of a millisecond, there's this race of blue people that run around and they move things and they get it. So when you think you're picking up a cup, it's not you. It's actually the blue people that are moving it. And you think it's you, but they move so fast you can't see them. And then they just ask me all these questions like, well, wouldn't we be able to tell? No, because they run away from the lasers in the lab, and so anything that they throw at me, I give them an example or a reason why we can't detect them, right? And that actually counts against a theory like that, right?
And so I want to, and I hear that a lot, reasons why mistyping happen. And if we assume the Enneagram is valid and it's true, we would probably expect some people to mistype when they're healthy or less healthy or at different times. But then we can be aware of that, and then we can test that. And there actually have been a few studies to look at people's types when they're under stress or not under stress, and it didn't match what was expected from the Enneagram. And this is, again, coming from people using and promoting the Enneagram, and even Again, one of those was a dissertation that Jerome Wagner was on that committee for. And so the same mistypes happen when people aren't healthy. Well, then, they should be moving in a specific direction according to what the Enneagram predicts. And that's just not what we see. And so, we want to take the claim and what the Enneagram's claiming and not just discount it. And when we do that, it still doesn't hold up.
Right.
I'd also question too what it means to be healthy and unhealthy. Like, we're complicated people. Sometimes there's certain areas of your life that are less healthy, but the other areas are actually really good or going really well. The Enneagram's just this, like, you're either healthy in a healthy spot or you're in an unhealthy spot. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and the McCords,
rather than a spectrum like we've been talking about. Yeah.
In the McCord's recent book too, they instead of looking at the lines of integration as your healthy and unhealthy side, they look at both of them, and basically, any type can move to any of these, and this is what it looks like in those situations. So now they're kind of trying to claim all of that for what it looks like when you're healthy or unhealthy for any of the types. And so they broaden that without explicitly saying that these things that people have been using with the Enneagram, the last 60 years is false. They just sort of broadened it and pretended like it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sean said, any advice for someone involved with a large ministry who is pushing the Enneagram on students? I don't want to do anything or anything to do with it, but people I work with just see me as narrow-minded and judgmental. So advice for Sean.
Good luck. I mean, I've noticed in different settings,
Right.
People, they don't like when the Enneagram is critiqued, and there's no one likes to be critiqued. But if I go to a research psychologist and tell him, his work on the Big Five is wrong, he'll probably sit down and listen to, okay, well, what did I get wrong? How can I improve it? Maybe ask, hey, let's publish a paper on this together, something like that, and try to make a better product. But with the Enneagram, it's often just shut down conversation that, you're angry, you're judgmental, you're not enlightened, maybe you just had a bad experience. So a lot of explaining it away. And so it's difficult. I actually tried to avoid it when we moved to Waco. When I started my PhD program, I didn't mention anything about it, and found out that the church we were attending had recently stopped using the Enneagram because they noticed people were stereotyping each other. But I didn't want to bring it up and talk about it and create controversy, because I was like, well, that's not really a hill I need to die on or really care enough about right now. And because it's that identity part. It's, if I'm using the Enneagram and it describes me, and now if you're critiquing the Enneagram as a whole, because it explains me and my identities in it, that's now an attack on me. And so it can be very difficult. And so prayer, patience, asking questions, I just don't think it's accurate. Why do you think it's accurate? What would make you think it's not accurate? And just, patience with those questions to find out why people trust it so much. If have you considered that it might be psychological bias, or maybe that, it's because of the Barnum effect or something like this. And it's hard because I know a research psychologist who uses it. Most psychologists don't have a very high opinion of it. In fact, I did a presentation on it at the academic conference, critiquing it. And one of the people tweeted, thanks for Jay for doing the Lord's work. He's a kind of among personality psychologists, it's generally universally despised. But, this one psychologist, uses it. And I asked him, like, well, don't you think that, it's just working because of the Barnum effect? He's like, yeah, probably, but, I still like it. I'm like, well, someone who knows the data, knows research, knows how to evaluate this, knows about the Barnum effect, and he's just, I still just like it. Like, he's still going to accept it. So it can be hard if people aren't even that knowledgeable about the various options.
Alexa, what would you say? Any advice?
Specific advice is definitely, I think it's going to take prayer. You could offer ask good questions and maybe offer some resources. But also keep in mind that I think people don't want to feel foolish or feel like they were fooled. So your defenses come up pretty quick. And so I think that we all have to acknowledge that you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't know how these things work to manipulate your brain, basically, then you can be taken in by it easily. So I think keeping that in mind, that's a lot of times, what's going on too, is that defensiveness.
Wasn't that Mark Twain that said it's easier to fool someone than convince them they've been fooled?
It's a good quote. I appreciate both of you and in sharing that, because it gets really sticky. I mean, it's difficult to tell someone, I think you're wrong about anything. And then, when it's about identity stuff, it becomes very personal very quickly. So prayer, patience, asking questions, being informed, having little tools in your pocket, like, well, have you heard of the Barnum effect, right? Things like that can just start to maybe make some headway there. Let's do just one more. Brittany said, I had someone tell me he's a 3 with trauma. Can you talk about what the intention is in adding something after the number? Trauma is something or not something I would throw around lightly, what people do.
I mean, I can imagine a lot of reasons why someone might do that. Maybe they're trying to connect and feel heard and give people additional insight. That because with the Enneagram, if you've had severe trauma, even as a child, that doesn't change your type, right? Or even as an adult, like maybe you've been a 3 your whole life, but now you had trauma and now you score more like a 5 or seem more like a 5, but the Enneagram doesn't allow with that. So they could be trying to add an additional level there. The kind of skeptic side of me says they're trying to justify why the Enneagram, they still use the Enneagram, even though it's not accurately describing them. It could, be lots of different reasons, both good and bad, but I think ultimately it's probably the person trying to be heard and to know and connect with another person.
Yeah, very good. Well, we are at an hour, and I promised you guys that we'd be done at about that point. So before we go, though, is there anything else that you want to add or share just as kind of a final thought from you guys?
I think we hit kind of all the big points, but I'm open to conversations if anyone wants to follow up. Pretty easy to find on social media. My website's down right now. I know some people have reached out about some of the articles I had on my website, and then I'm sort of in the middle of things because I changed over with some different providers and just haven't had the time to get it back up. But I'm happy to talk if anyone wants to shoot me a message on social media.
Perfect. And where can we find you, Alexa?
You can find me at Mama Bear Apologetics. I have some articles there. I'm on some of the podcasts or on my YouTube channel, which should just be at Alexa Cramer. I've got a Enneagram series going right now.
Perfect. And for those who are watching, in the description of this video, I posted links to some of the things that Jay and Alexa have written, both videos, and Jay had published in Christianity Today, so you can get the link to there too. So, well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This hopefully has been eye-opening and helpful as we talk through this. And for us, really the goal is, yes, we want to grow in Christ. We want to grow in our faith, but to do so wisely and with tools that don't just feel right, but are true and lead us into all truth. And so really enjoyed our conversation, Jay, Alexa. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.